So the purpose of this tutorial is to go over texture baking in 3ds Max and xNormal. I'll also be going over a lot of theory, so if you're using a different 3D package other than this, that's fine too, because a lot of this will transfer over. But really what I want to focus on is just real world examples of why your bakes might be coming out, whether it be errors or it's not coming out looking the way you figured it would. That's what I'm going to be focusing on mostly. So it's not going to be necessarily on how just to use the Baker and Max or just use xNormal, but an overall view of texture baking in general. I'm also, later on in the tutorial, I'm going to be using a project I'm working on, so we're going to go a little bit beyond just, looking at a couple boxes and stuff like that. But I'll show you a whole workflow from coming out of ZBrush, bringing it into Max, setting up the low poly, and doing the bakes, and then out to the final render, checking for errors, all that kind of stuff. The first thing I want to talk about is how important it is to line up the low and high poly mesh. This might be something, some people kind of overlook or don't put as much emphasis on as you could, but it's absolutely critical that you line up the low and high poly as close as possible. So it's kind of like a balancing act between how much geometry should I have in my low poly, how much should I have, and how much time should I spend lining all this stuff up to make sure, it gives you a proper bake. You can think of the Baker as sort of like a digital camera in the sense that it only records down what's in front of it. It doesn't know one way or another what you're trying to do, and it can't really correct its own errors. It just simply records down what's put in front of it or what's been set up. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is press Alt-W on my keyboard to maximize the viewport and kind of get into what these examples are all about here. The example on the far left here, the red one, is an ideal setup. It's exactly how you want it. Everything's lined up perfectly, and it would give a great ideal bake. The next one here in the middle, the blue one, is an example where I intentionally kind of skewed out the ends of the low poly. And the one on the far right, this green one here, I intentionally skewed out the high poly. So this kind of, 3 examples of what might happen along the way in your workflow. But going back to the first one, I'm going to grab onto the low poly. I'm going to hit Alt-X on my keyboard to go into X-ray mode. And we're going to zoom in on the edges, because it really, with something like this, like a hard surface setup like this, the edges are what's really critical. It's kind of what we're looking for. It's what's going to give you that nice smooth high poly look on your low poly. But if you take notice, look how closely and how exact the the low poly edge is in comparison to the high poly. When it's set up like this, it's going to give you that nice smooth bake transition across the low poly mesh. So when the camera's zoomed out, it'll give you that illusion that the thing is much more detailed in high poly than it actually is. The next example over here, and this is what you ideally want. This is what we're looking for, whether it be a hard surface object like this, or an organic one like a rock or something like that. The next one over here, I intentionally kind of bent up and skewed up the low poly to show you an example of, let's say we already had our high poly set up and we're building our low, and I was a little quick with it or whatever, and things aren't lining up. In a situation like this, we're actually not going to record down that smooth transition in the proper location. Even though your bake will turn out and there won't be any technical errors with it, the actual location of that smooth edge transition won't be recorded down in the proper spot, as opposed to right over here. So if let me grab both of these. Take note on the edge of here and on the edge of here, the difference. So where that smooth edge is actually going to be recorded down will be in the wrong spot. Same goes for this, but just for a different reason. Okay, so I went ahead and did the bakes, and I brought the scene into Marmoset tool bag, and I just kind of wanted to go over our baking and rendering error issues. If you remember back, the red one was the one that was properly done, and as you can see, it looks decent, it looks solid, the edges are holding up. But on the blue one here, on this corner and over here, is where I kind of skewed the low poly off as comparison to the high. But if we come down here on the bottom side, you can already see what's going on. Over here we have this nice smooth transition, that high poly look. But then if you come over to here where I had skewed it off, we actually lose that smooth transition. And that's because the normal map is actually baked in the wrong location and it's low. If I come up here, you can actually see where that smooth edge was recorded down, which is right here. That dark area, that should actually be up along here. And depending on the camera angle, it gets worse or better, but nevertheless, it is there, and hopefully this gives you an idea as to why it's so important to line up the low and high poly, especially on a hard surface object like this. Anything like a gun or a tank or a vehicle, whatever, stuff like that, it's absolutely critical. You could have one of the most beautiful looking high polys ever, but if stuff ain't properly lined up, it's just never going to give you the proper bakes. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. The next thing I want to go over is smoothing groups. With this project here, this example, I had the smoothing group set to 1. I know in different applications, like in Max you have smoothing groups and they're all numbered, and Maya's a little bit different, but the theory is the same. So I'm going to be going over that next, and then we'll be moving on to some more baking stuff. Okay, now that we're back to Max, I kind of wanted to go over smoothing groups, baking, and unwrapping, and how those kind of all correlate together. This isn't overly complicated, and there's not a lot to know, but there are a couple things that you do need to know so your workflow goes as smooth as possible. But in this scene, I have 3 different examples of smoothing group setups. And the first one here, basically I don't have any smoothing groups set at all on this mesh. On the second one here, the bottom half is set to 1, and the top half is set to 2. So you can see there's 2 different smoothing groups on there. You kind of see that hard edge running along there. On the third one, I have the entire mesh actually set to all 1 smoothing group. Now on the viewport, let me go down here real quick, kind of show you what's going on. If you go to polygon smoothing groups, you can see everything, the entire mesh is set to 1. And in your viewport like this, when it's all set to 1, it kind of just looks like a big blob on your screen. And that's fine, and that's how I actually recommend doing baking when it comes to either organic-like meshes or a hard surface object like this. But that's not to say you can't do multiple smoothing groups on a mesh when you're using baked normals. That's perfectly fine too, and that's really what I wanted to focus on with this section of the tutorial. But let me hit Alt-Q on the keyboard to isolate this. And whether or not you use multiple smoothing groups or not is entirely up to you. It might depend on what you're doing or whatever. But if you are, you need to unwrap the mesh in a certain way. If you're brand new to baking and you've been doing stuff along this way, you've probably been unwrapping just kind of how you needed to or how you see fit or whatnot. But when you're running multiple smoothing groups and you are doing normal map baking, the mesh has to be unwrapped in a specific way. And so what I mean by that is actually, let me just kind of throw an unwrap UVW modifier on here and show you what I have going on. Now, if you remember back, like I was talking about, I had the bottom half on smoothing group 1 and the top half on smoothing group 2. The important part, though, is to take notice on how I have the UV islands laid out. On the bottom half, which is smoothing group 1, I have the entire UV island separated from the top half, or this section up here on smoothing group 2. There's nothing welded together. They're completely separate. And this is how you need to unwrap if you're doing baking with multiple smoothing groups. If you don't do this, what happens is you'll end up with a black seam that runs along, or not a black seam, but a black edge where these 2 smoothing groups meet together. There's actually absolutely no way to remedy this other than maybe going into Photoshop and trying to paint it out. But that's a terrible workflow, and it's going to burn up a ton of time, and just totally kill the project off. So when you're setting up your low poly and you want to use multiple smoothing groups and you're planning on it, also plan on separating the UV islands, kind of like I have here. I know this is a really simple project or a simple example, but just keep that in mind. As far as the top half goes, you can also see I have these separated. That's fine. This all here was on smoothing group number 2, this top half and this bottom half. And I just have these separated here just so they fit on the UV sheet, a little better. That doesn't really matter. So to kind of recap, if you have a separation in smoothing groups, you have to have a separation on your UV islands. But if they're together, like these are here, you don't have to. It does, you can have it either way. So I could have, for example, split this all apart and welded it all down onto here. That would be perfectly fine, having those two together. But that's kind of what I wanted to go over on this one. And with this next step, or the next area I wanted to go over, is actually optimizing your mesh, your low poly for real-time use. Because the examples I've been using so far actually aren't quite optimized, and I kind of wanted to go over that too. All right, for this next section here, I'd like to kind of get into optimizing your mesh before you actually do any unwrapping and baking. And really what's involved in that is just getting rid of extra vertices and edges that aren't really needed. Going back to kind of box modeling 101, if there isn't any, if you have any extra vertices or edges that aren't supporting your silhouette, they really should be gotten rid of. And basically it comes down to removing edges or welding extra vertices together. So kind of to expand on this example from what we've been working on, I made another couple meshes here and extruded out just a couple things from our original. If you look in the viewport and I turn off my edges, you can see these two meshes look identical. I can do a render. They render out identical, but the overall footprint in either a game engine or your viewport, it can be literally cut in half. This one here is 104 verts, and this one here is 52 verts. And each of these meshes, either one will bake out just fine, but is what it comes down to, like I was saying before, is welding up these extra vertices and getting rid of these extra edges. That should be something that you should definitely get used to and do all the time. I know some people they kind of fight you tooth and nail about having triangles on the mesh. It's got to all be quads and this and that. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't have to be all quads. There are a couple cases where keeping quads helps, especially with high poly modding. But for your low poly, and especially for organic stuff or environment stuff, you want to strip the mesh down to as simple as possible. It's easier to unwrap, it's easier to deal with, and it's a lot less stress on the computer to try to render out the final scene. So as far as going in and doing this, there really isn't. I'm just going to go over a couple of tools. What's available in Max. Going over to this one here, basically. It's literally as simple as, for one example, is using your target weld tool and just clicking on it and welding something up. There is another tool that in Max 2012 or later they came out with in the polygon modeling tools. I really haven't touched base on this. This is this tab here. It comes default right up top on the top of your screen, like when you just install and open Max. If you don't see anything at all, if you look right up here, make sure this is toggled on. It's basically a toggle ribbon. If that isn't lit up, it won't show up at all. But if you go into the Freeform section of this, there's a tab or a button here called Optimize. What this is a quick way to optimize and strip away extra topology, extra verts that you don't need. I use this all the time. It's really quick. I'm not going to get too deep into this because that's not really what this tutorial is about, but just to kind of touch base on it. Basically, if you turn the optimize tool on. It's a toggle. You can see it kind of lit up blue. And then while I'm in vertex sub-object mode, I'm just going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to click and drag up this mesh, and it'll start welding up extra vertices that I don't need. And this also works with edges. There's extra options and stuff, for welding up and getting rid of edges and stuff like that. But this is the general idea. How you go about doing it, it's completely up to you. And of course, Maya or another 3D package might work differently. But the whole point is optimizing your low poly mesh before you actually do the unwrap and actually do the baking it's critical. It really is, especially if you want to do some nice professional work that's not going to dog down on your game or whatever kind of real-time project you might be working on. So that pretty much concludes the optimizing mesh part. I know it's pretty quick, but it was just kind of give you an idea of, make sure to look for it was the main point of this. But the next part I'm going to move on to is actually setting up the cage. I'm going to be using Max for the example, but once again, this all kind of transfers to other 3D packages. And it's for the most part straightforward, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to show you, wanted to talk about so you know and you're aware of it. But we'll be moving on to that one next. So with this next part of the tutorial, I'm going to be talking about quite a few different things. The first thing we'll be talking about is setting up a cage in Max. And some of it will be Max specific, but I'll also be going over a lot of theory and different things to look for, no matter kind of what you're working in. I'll also be talking about a common baking error and how to remedy that problem using supporting edges. I haven't mentioned supporting edges yet, but I actually did run into a problem with this project here, and I'll be showing you what happened, what I did to fix it, and how to kind of move on from that. Before we begin with all that, I'm actually going to talk first about what I have going on here. And basically, this is a really common, if not the most common, setup for doing a high poly mesh in a modeling program. What we have here is a number of different elements that are all kind of brought together to bring you the whole. So this is an all box model. This isn't all one piece. One thing I have here too that I haven't had in my previous demonstrations is floating geometry. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that. But basically what floating geometry is extra high poly geometry that's floating above the surface of a mesh, and there really isn't anything that correlates over to the low poly. Is what we're doing here is we're just straight baking this right into the surface of this cube. If you look in the viewport, if I kind of zoom in on here, you can see that it looks like it was actually almost modeled straight into the surface of here. If I do a render, you can see that it looks like it was part of there, and that's also how the baker itself will see it too. So you take that normal information and bake that right down into the surface of the low poly over here. But I'm also there's a couple different things on how to set up the cage and stuff, like when you're using floating geometries. It's a couple different things to look for. So I wanted to talk about that too. The next thing I wanted to mention also was baking down geometry that isn't a part of your low poly. If you look here, kind of see what I got going on here. We have an area that's been extruded in to the high poly mesh, but I really don't have anything over here that is on the low poly mesh. And when this really isn't a tutorial on modeling, but since I have it all here, I might as well mention it. Anytime you're going to be doing something like this, you want to actually bevel the edges inward, just slightly. Same thing if it was extruded outward. You want to kind of taper those in. And the reason for that is so we can give the baker some normal information on the inside of this area here. If we didn't have that, is what's going to actually happen. It's just going to be sort of a steep drop off, and there won't be really much depth information. All we would really get is that ring. You kind of be able to see once we hop over into Toolbag, kind of how it ended up and how it looked. But just kind of be aware of that. Like I was saying, this isn't a high poly modeling demo or anything like that, but I just wanted to mention it. Okay, moving on to the cage part of the tutorial here. Basically what I have in my scene is our initial one, the one we were just kind of looking at. And over here I have a couple of test bakes. The one in blue is the first one here that had errors, and the red one here is the repaired version. Like I was saying, I'll show you kind of what happened over in Marmoset Tool Bag, rendering out real time. But before I get into all that, there is one more thing I need to mention. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, if it isn't done right, you will get errors from it. And so let me kind of grab onto this first one here. I'm going to isolate that. And you might have heard it already before you might be doing it, but it's basically called the exploded method, or exploding individual elements away from each other, because anytime when you're doing a normal bake, you have elements that are overlapping or crossing each other. At the area or the intersection point where they do come together, you'll actually get baking errors. So to avoid this, it's pretty simple. I'm gonna actually isolate this. All you have to do is come in and grab these individual elements and detach them, just like this. And then come in and grab both the low and high poly elements together and explode them away. That's all we mean by exploding. It's just we're taking these parts and separating them so there are no elements crossing each other. And that's what's gonna give you the errors. As far as the floating geometry goes, that's a different story. You can just leave that the way it is, because these really shouldn't be sunk in or below the mesh like that. Now in Max, there actually is another option. It's under the render to texture dialog box. So I'm going to hit 0 on my keyboard. Actually, let me grab my low poly again. I'm going to hit 0 on the keyboard to bring up the render texture dialog box. And under options, and then under resolve, if you see under here, hit only matching material ID. If you have that turned on and you have assign material IDs to specific elements of the mesh, that way we're telling the baker that to basically ignore anything that's crossing each other. So for example, we'd have this on material ID 1 and this would be on material ID 2, and they're sitting just like that. That way the baker will know what's going on, and you can just actually leave everything the way it sits. So you won't actually have to explode anything away from each other. But I just wanted to bring that up, mention it. It is in Max. I'm not sure if like Maya or Blender have this option, so I just thought I'd kind of mention that. But actually moving on to the cage part of this, I'm going to start with the initial one, the one we had errors with. I'm going to isolate this. And at this point, when you get ready to bake, you should have had the high poly finish. You should have the low poly kind of blocked out. And you're either going to be starting your test bake, or you're going to be actually, you would have had the low poly unwrapped, and you're going to be doing your actual final bakes on it. So the first thing you want to do, though, to get this set up is to grab the low poly, and we're going to hit 0 on our keyboard again to bring up the render to texture dialog box. And the first thing, you might be new to this box, and you're kind of looking at it going, wow, there's a lot of stuff here, but it's really not that bad. I'll walk you through the whole thing from start to finish. But the first thing you want to do is under the projection mapping tab here, you'll notice that the enabled isn't ticked. Now you can actually do texture baking in 3ds Max and not use a high poly. That's completely fine. In our case, we are using the high, so we want to tick that. The next thing we need to do is go to pick, because it needs to know, okay, what high polys are we going to be baking here? One thing you want to keep in mind too is if you have if you had many different things in your scene, it'll show up here. So be aware that, like for example, I had some boxes and cubes and whatnot going on out here. We don't want to add that to our bake. We just want to add what we're actually trying to bake. In my case, we just have this, so I'm going to actually grab everything. And the first thing that's going to happen when we do this is your cage is going to be all blown apart and exploded apart like this, which is completely fine. It's normal. And to remedy that, basically you just hit reset, and it snaps the cage back to the low poly. The cage itself is actually a representation of the low poly, so that's kind of its 0 point. That's its zeroing out point. The next thing I like to do is to turn on shaded, because it's a little bit easier to see the cage and where it's sitting. But once you get this all set up, the next thing to do is go where it says push amount right here. We want to, you can come in and actually just put in a number like that, 10 or whatever, but I usually don't go with something like that. So what I usually do is just come in and grab the spinner here, and we're going to push this up. just so it passes out, or passes this first area here. Now if you notice, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier about setting up your cage when you have floating geometry or anything like that, we actually have to push this cage past all the high poly. Whether it be something like this or an environment piece, under no circumstances can you have the cage below the high poly. You'll get baking errors and ray misses every time. So in this case, we kind of already have the cage past this part, and I don't want to keep pushing this out. That's the next thing I kind of want to mention too, is really you never really want to bake in a situation like this. You want the cage hugging as close down to your high and low poly as possible. But the problem is, if I come in here, let me reset this. If I come in here and I go like this, okay, that looks pretty good. And I notice, we have issues up here. Is what I want to do, and is what I normally do, is push these out separately. So the next step is basically to come in and grab the element, which grabs the entire element. You can see that probably turned red. Hopefully you can see that on this video. But the next step to do is I'm going to actually hold down Control. And while I'm holding down Control, I'm going to click the vertice part, this cage right here. I'm going to click that. What that does is allows me to push this section out on its own by itself, which I'm going to do right now. We'll come back down in here and push this out. So that's kind of a quick rundown of how you want to set up the cage. And it looks like this part might even still be, yeah, there we go. Something like that. Now, normally when you're doing your bakes, there's a number of settings you're going to do to increase the resolution and stuff of it. But, when you're doing your initial bake, you want to just kind of stay low, like at 512 or 1024, because we'll be doing a couple passes of this to get to kind of fine tune that cage and get everything set up. The next thing I want to do, or want to talk about before I get too far over anything here is what you want to do too is normally stick with just using this push and this tool here. The reason for that is because when you use this is actually pushing the cage in and out along the normals coming off the vertices. If you come in, for example, let me go to my move. If I come in and I start going like this, or I come in and scale things out like this, it's just doing basically, it's running off the scale tool. It's not actually following the normals. So I avoid doing that altogether. I always come in and just grab individual parts here and push these in and out along the way. So let's just call this good for now, and we'll be moving along. Okay, padding is really, it's important for doing your normal bake, and it's really not all that important for doing much else. What padding does on your normals is it allows the baker to kind of take what it needs where your seams are. So and it helps prevent baking and smoothing errors and stuff like that. So usually for like a 2K texture, I'll run my padding at 16. And that 16 is basically 16 pixels. And for a 1024, I'll cut that in half. But the next part here I want to talk about is sometimes this will get it messed up a little bit where it says mapping coordinates. Sometimes you come in here and it'll kind of be like set like this, and this might be on 3 or whatever. That's fine if you're actually intending to bake down to a different UV channel. In most cases, you won't be. So we're going to be having this set to use existing channel, both of these, and both of these should generally be set to 1. So just make sure of that. I've seen that come up a couple times where it was set to a different value, but yeah, we want to keep that definitely on 1. And I'll put that back on 16. The next thing here, this is where you actually plug in what maps you're intending to bake. So we're going to select Add, and here's the current maps that that we can bake out from here. In our case, we're going to be doing a normals map, so we'll highlight that, and you just click Add Elements. The next part here is basically asking you, okay, where do we want to save this, and what name do we want to assign to it? So all you're going to do is click this the 3 dots box here, and it's going to open up the dialog box. And this is where you'll say, in our case here, I'm actually just going to overwrite this because I want to show you a couple things with the actual saving of the texture. So I'm going to click this here, and it's going to ask me if I want to overwrite. And this is what I want to show you. Normally, I don't know really what you like to work in. I normally work in targets. They're a great format to work in. Usually you're going to be using 24 bits per pixel or 32. 32 is if you're going to be using an alpha channel. We're not really not in this situation, but it'll be one or the other. The second thing to look for is this by default when you first install Max, this will be on compressed. Turn that off. Normally when you're texturing and when you're baking, we don't want to compress it just yet. I usually work in uncompressed textures. I'll bring it into Photoshop, uncompressed, and then finally when it goes out to the game engine or whatever you're working on, then we'll go ahead and compress it. The pre-multiplied alpha, that has to do with your anti-aliasing on the alpha channel, so I leave that on. I just leave it on, whether I'm going to be using an alpha or not. Doesn't matter. So once we got this kind of set up, I just click OK, and that's it. Like I was saying, as far as what size texture you want to use, usually 1024 will be fine. And then your final bake, you can set to 2048. You can also plug in a straight numerical value. So if you're baking out to like 4K, they don't have that here, but you can just type it in there. So we'll set that back to 1024. Now this part here, I had for my previous bake, normally this isn't checked, render to files only. I usually check that. The reason for that is because it just renders out to the files only. It doesn't create any kind of shell material or anything like that. If you like using that, that's fine. I just generally don't use it. And then the next part I want to talk about here with the box, the rollout here, is under options. We're kind of going back to here. Under normal map space, one of the most common settings for doing normal map baking is flipping the Y channel or the green channel up or down, plus or minus, and it just depends. Like Max, for example, is default Y negative, and that's why this is on down right now. This is where you're going to set the normal map to either Y positive or Y negative. I normally work in Y up because the tool bag's like that, and I just kind of stay in that, but whatever you want to bake out to is fine. So, I'll just keep it at down for now because that's, this is fine for what we're doing. The next thing you should look for under setup, and I already had these set up before, but this is going to be under area by default, and this might be turned off. So if you're doing your test baking, that's completely fine, just leaving it like this. When you finally go to bake your final textures out, you actually want to change this anti-aliasing up to Catmull ROM, and then making sure your global super sampling is on. The two common ones is Max Star or Max 2.5 Star or Hamserly here. When I use that, I usually set this to a value of 1. So one of these two. In most cases, I just stick with Max Star. This one takes a lot longer to render, and I usually use this if I'm doing like projection mapping or something like that. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about is under. Let me go back to render here, right here. Apply motion blur. We're going to turn that off, and then image motion blur. We're going to turn that off. So this is kind of long-winded, and this is how the baker whatever works in Max. So if you're not, I also want to do cover xNormal too. But these are the general settings that I usually use. If you kind of forget different things or whatever, you can always kind of come back and look at it again. But once you're to this point, you're ready to bake. I'm not going to actually bake this out right now, but these are the settings that that you should look for and kind of how things should be looking. So the next thing I want to talk about too, I'm actually going to take a step backwards to. We're going to go back to our cage because I kind of forgot to mention it. But the next thing I want to talk about is with the cage too. And then you also want to avoid skewing the cage out. I've kind of seen sometimes a couple different videos and whatnot. People coming in and moving the cage around like this. This is definitely something you want to avoid altogether. The reason for that is because this like I was mentioning before, the cage is a representation of your low poly mesh. And if I come in and move this out, now I'm telling the baker that basically the low poly mesh is this, and it's going to skew your normals. It's not going to line up, and things aren't going to look where they're supposed to. I guess it's kind of an obvious thing, but I thought I'd mention it just kind of throw it out there. But the next part here I'm actually be going on to is the baking issues I had, and then how I fixed them and stuff like that. So we'll be moving on to that one next. So as long-winded as that last section, there's actually a couple things I forgot to mention, and I wanted to talk about it because it is pretty important. But the first thing I want to talk about under the projection options box, and I want to talk about the ray mischeck tool and what that does, because I never really showed you what's happening when you have ray misses going on. So I'm going to close that out real quick. I'm going to come in and just back off the cage so I kind of guarantee myself some ray misses. And we'll render this out, and I just kind of want to show you what's going on. So everywhere in red is where ray misses are occurring. Basically, it's returning a null or zero value because the cage itself is actually above the high poly mesh. Another thing to note too is if you notice that even though I have the cage sitting above below the floating geometry, there are no ray misses showing up here. So if you're using a lot of floating geometry, at least in the Baker and Max, be aware that it's not going to show up red for you. It's not going to point that out. So that's just kind of visually something you'll need to keep an eye on. The next thing I wanted to mention too is under the ray mischeck tool, once you get the cage finally set up and things are looking good for you, you can actually shut this off if you want. I've had situations before where I've had everything looked great, but there was just literally a pixel wide by 5 pixels long that I had ray misses going on, and it baked down onto the texture, and then I had to go paint it out later on in the workflow. It wasn't anything that was going to show up or look bad, but it was there. And to avoid that altogether, you can shut this off on your final pass. It's up to you. But the next thing I want to talk about here is under the normal map space tool or options tab, and by default tangents checked and Y is down, but I'd like to talk about object space normal maps. Now if you switch this over to local X, Y, Z, this is actually for baking out object space normal maps, and let me actually pull over a couple examples from my other monitor here. Here we have a tangent space normal map, and this here is an object space normal map. Starting out with the tangent space, this is mostly the most common normal map we'll be using for game engines and real-time applications and stuff like that. And the main reason for that is because it's so malleable and easy for 3D artists to work with. Like right now, I can bring this into Photoshop and I can do overlays and all sorts of edits, especially if you're using Endo or something like that. They're great to work with. They're easy to work with. With object space normal maps, that isn't quite the case. It's not as easy to do overlays and do edits on this type of texture. Another disadvantage of the object space map is you can't have any UV overlaying. Each island has to be unique. The reason for that is because every part of this map references specifically to a part of your mesh. It's somewhat the case here, but not really. But with this, it's one-to-one. You can't do any overlaying, and you can't do any mirroring of the mesh too. And it's what I mean by that let me slide these out of the way here real quick. If I wanted to come in and mirror this box over, let's say this was a part of a big ship or something like that, and I was going to use a bunch of these, and I just want to quick mirror this to the other side, it wouldn't work with an object space normal map. It would have to be on a separate UV sheet, or it'd have to be unique on our current sheet. I've been saying a lot of negative things about the object space normal map, but there are a couple positives. One of them is basically it's actually less taxing and less of a load on your computer to render an object space normal map. The bakes also come up really, really nice. So they're usually really crisp. There's less likely to get small anomalies and errors and all that kind of stuff in the texture. I know these bakes here they're terrible, but they're just test bakes, so I can't really show you something that's just amazing as far as how well these look when they come out. But that's one advantage, or a couple advantages, of the object space normal map. So that pretty much concludes, the extra things I wanted to talk about as far as the normal maps and that the Baker and the Ramus checks was concerned. But we are going to be moving on to the next section with the baking errors and how I went and fixed them. So as I mentioned before, we were going to come into Toolbag and check out this baking issue I had, in the real-time render, and I kind of go over and show you what I ran into and how I fixed it. But the first thing, the one in blue is the one with the baking issue. The one in red was the one I fixed. So I'm actually going to hide the fixed one, and we'll take a closer look at the one in blue. Basically, if you take notice, first of all, is look at how the high poly floating geometry actually ended up on the top of the mesh, how they're kind of skewed inward. They're all like that, no matter which one you look at, and depending on the camera angle, it can look better or worse. There's also an issue here up top where the normals are trying to run across the edge of the peak here. So that's what would happen. This is pretty common. When you're doing something like this. So actually, I'm going to move on to the fixed version and kind of show you a side-by-side comparison. But looking at them straight on front here, you can see the difference between the two. These are much, much straighter as opposed to these ones here. Same thing if we kind of look at it, end to end like here. And then, of course, the peak part here. Let me rotate that around. You can see the difference between the two. So how did I fix this? What happened? How did I fix this? Let me actually turn on my wireframe on the edges, and you can see what's going on here actually on the low poly, how I went ahead and fixed this stuff. With this one here, it's kind of the traditional box modeling edges and topology. But with this one, I actually added supporting edges. And in addition to that, I inserted vertices, or I have a cross section here with vertices right in the middle of where that high poly floating geometry was sitting. So so what is actually happening here? Why did this break? Basically, when a normal map, or when you do your baking, it has to go around hard edges, 90-degree angles and stuff like that. Problems start to come up. Baking in normal maps don't like angles. The most ideal situation you'll ever bake in is basically just on a flat plane, just a plane. And in this case, we've got a 90-degree angle here, a 90-degree angle here, and then not a 90, but another steep angle here. And on top of that, everything is set to one smoothing group. So what I'm doing is I'm asking the normal map to kind of take care of all the smoothing and the shading for that, and it's too much. So how do I fix this? One way, like I showed you, is adding supporting edges to the high poly, to the low poly mesh. Another way to do it is actually to break these off into separate smoothing groups. So another example could have been putting this on smoothing group 1, putting this on smoothing group 2, so on and so forth. But then we're breaking apart our UV islands, and it's a viable workflow. You can totally do it. It's up to you. But the other way to do it too is actually chamfer stuff out. When you add chamfers to your mesh, it actually it reduces the angle. Like right now we have a 90, and if I were to chamfer this, we'd end up with a 45. So you'd be going from a 45 to 45 down, and that would help the baker a lot as far as just trying to get rid of these issues. And then not necessarily angle related, but inserting vertices in the middle of the high poly floating geometry basically gives you a normal coming straight out of that mesh in that area, and that can help tremendously for stuff like this. Going over to the let me turn the wireframe off. Over to the tube. Basically, like something like this, we didn't run into any issues. There's really no baking errors here on either of the sides, so that was fine there. But once again, we don't have a lot of steep, hard angles like this here. From here to here isn't you know, a 90-degree angle, not even really close to it, and the rest of it's just a cylinder or a tube. So that's kind of the rundown of, you know, what to look for. Once again, you know, adding supporting edges like this, like how I have it here with vertices, or separating the smoothing groups, is the kind of two main ways to remedy the problem. But that pretty much wraps up that's the section of the tutorial on how, you know, to solve baking issue problems. We're going to be moving on to the project I was working on. It's kind of a, you know, an actual project, not just a bunch of boxes and stuff like that. And then we'll be doing the complete workflow with that, and I'll be moving on from there. Okay, moving on to the next part of the tutorial, I decided to go ahead and start out in ZBrush to give you an overall idea of what we'll be working on for the next section. My goal here is basically to apply everything we've learned from the beginning to an actual project, you know, so we're not just working on boxes and kind of doing the same thing. But in this case, what the part we'll be focusing on, though, is this side holster here. I'm kind of at the point of where I'm doing the baking and stuff like that on it, and I'd like to kind of go over that and use that as our example. I started this out actually in Max and kind of blocked it out. I kind of like using that workflow with stuff like this, and then bring it into ZBrush and doing extra sculpting and extra details on it. I didn't do any hard sculpting like on the backpack here, but the reason I brought it in here, let me go into Solo real quick here, is just to add extra stitching and that kind of burlap look detail to it. And the reason I like doing this is because it's all the stuff bakes across seams. It really saves a lot of time. You know, if you're doing the composite texturing and baking and stuff like that, when you got all this information baked down going into Photoshop, it just really, things kind of really zip along quick, and you know, your end results usually turn out really good. But like I was saying, you know, this started out in Max, so I think I'm going to hop over into there next and kind of give you an overview of how I started out and then what we're going to go from here, since I already have the high poly finished. But let me hop over into Max real quick, and we'll go from here. So this is the original piece here, and I kind of just, you know, figured out where I wanted it and blocked it out. Let me actually go into solo mode with that quick. And this is a high poly. I brought it over into ZBrush as a high. And the way I had it initially set up is, you know, like a typical hard surface mesh coming out, you know, working in 3ds Max or another modeling program like this. So it's what I wanted to show you with the next part is basically, you know, what we do from here. You know, we have sort of our blocked out low, but it's, you know, it still has all the supporting edges. And I got my high poly over in ZBrush, but where do we go from here? How should we, you know, line all this stuff up and do the bakes? And that's what I was going to do next. Okay, so I went ahead and I started removing some of the extra edges and whatnot on the low poly, and I kind of got a side-by-side comparison of what we originally had. But before I get into all that, I just want to mention a couple of things too. The workflow I'm using here isn't exactly the best or worst workflow there is. It just happens to be what I'm, you know, using on this particular piece. So I just don't want you to think that this, you know, you have to come in here into Max or a modeling program and, you know, block stuff out and do anything like that. I could have just as easily started out in ZBrush and built this out and then brought this into Max and built a low poly around that. Or I could have just went ahead and, you know, built a low poly itself and not have ever done a high and just brought that over too. So I just kind of wanted to mention that. So I just didn't want you to think that, you know, you have to go in and do this particular workflow each and every time, because you don't. But moving along with that, I'm actually going to grab both of these and isolate them both, and then we're going to check out what I have going on here. So this was the original one, the high poly. You can see the difference in the topology and what I actually ended up removing. I went in and got rid of all these supporting edges and whatnot that you needed for that. And at the next step, I actually don't know how much more I want to remove from here, because I don't have really a reference of the high poly itself. So, you know, after cleaning all this stuff up, is the next thing I'm going to do is actually use GoZ, and I'm going to bring in the lowest res version of the high poly from ZBrush. So I'm going to Alt Tab over to ZBrush, and we're going to grab this guy here, and I'm going to use GoZ as soon as my computer catches up. All right, there we go. And we'll click on that, and then we'll click Continue. And this is, you know, it's got to do its thing and start thinking. Let me go back over into Max real quick. Let it do its thing here. It'll pop over here. But the reason I need to do this is, like I was saying, I don't know exactly how much I want to remove, and chances are that the low poly isn't exactly lining up perfectly as with the high poly. But the first thing I like to do is, you know, when it comes in here, it's going to be yellow or pink or something like that. I personally don't like that, so I go over here and I get rid of the pink edge or the extra color edges, and I just turn it to, I have kind of a color I always like to use. It's just a dark black. And not only that, I like to add my own custom material to it. Here I've got kind of a red material, and I got the opacity turned down to 30. Somewhere between, like, I don't know, 20 to 50. I like to back that off. So we're just going to assign that material to selected. And the reason I do that is so I can actually see through the high poly mesh on the low and get a really good idea where things are lining up. So I'm going to grab both these. I'm going to Alt-Q them and to isolate them. And we're actually going to come in here and start taking a much closer look at what we have to do to line this up. I mean, you can see right off the bat here, you know, there's really, this isn't really going to ideally bake. So I'm going to have to add extra chamfers and whatnot up here to get this cleaned up and have a much smoother transition. That's one thing when it comes to like spheres and circles or anything like this. You know, the baker can't do anything here. It's just going to be really choppy and nasty along here. So this has to be smoothed out. Edges like this can probably gotten rid of. Anything on the back side, this can all be cleaned up. Stuff like this, another thing you do is hit Alt-X on your keyboard to go into X-ray mode. And I'm going to actually, yeah, okay, that's unshaded. But I can get a closer look of how these things are lining up. You can see there's kind of a gap here. I don't think I'm probably going to keep this, maybe, but you know, we'll see how it goes as this project moves along. But so I don't eat up a ton of video time. Is what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, and I'm going to clean up some of this, and then we'll come back and take a look at where things actually ended up. So I actually came back a little sooner than I was planning on because there was some tools I wanted to show you. I just don't want to go ahead and run past this and then have you wondering how I went about actually doing some of this. Basically, in the Graphite Modeling Tools tab under Freeform, we have an option right over here. You have three options, basically draw on grid, draw on surface, or draw on selection. So what we want to do is select draw on surface. And then right here, I already have it selected, but normally it would just say pick, and you would select this, and then come down and grab onto your high poly mesh that we'll be working on. Is what that does is it tells these tools that, you know, I'm working on the low poly, but I'm using the high poly as a reference in one way or another. And to kind of give you a quick rundown on how these tools work, some of the most common ones that I kind of use is the first one here is the conform brush. And I usually come down, I already have this set to 10, but usually I set that to 10. If it isn't, you know, you should set it somewhere a little higher around there, like around 10 or so. But the way this works is if I hold down my control key, it actually adjusts the outer amount, and that's the fall off. If I hold down my shift key, that adjusts the inner amount, and that's the full strength of the tool. Is what this tool does is actually, once I come across the mesh and I hold down my left mouse button, it actually starts snapping to the surface of the high poly mesh. So this is a quick way to come in and, you know, getting your low poly and your high poly lined up. One thing you have to do though is be careful that it's not going to work perfectly on every scenario, because there's a lot of different tools here, and each of them kind of do their own thing. So this is kind of just like brute force. It's like like a baseball bat. We're just kind of, it can come in and do anything. It doesn't know specifically what you're trying to do. So I'm going to back out of that a couple times, kind of show you the next tool. But the next one here, under the same, it kind of works the same way, but it's actually the relax conform brush. If I select that, is what it does is it snaps the surface like the conform brush does, but also at the same time it averages your vertices out, or it relaxes it out, similar to any other kind of relax tool. But to use that, it works the same way. You just hover it over the top, and it starts to come in and average those things out. I use this once in a while, with care, or being careful, because it doesn't know a particular kind of edge flow or anything that you're trying to do maybe to it. All it does is it just averages things out. The next one I wanted to show you, and I use this all the time too, is right up the top, drag. And the way that works is it works the same way as the other two tools, but it allows you to move individual vertices right on top of the surface of the high poly. So, in a case like this, I could almost just come in and start adjusting these vertices, for example, right at that edge where that kind of that belt loop was, or something like that. That's another great example of how this works. Now, let's say, for example, I didn't have my low poly at all, right? I'll actually go ahead and I'm going to remove that out of the scene and just trying to grab onto my high poly here. And I'm going to go into my left viewport, and then I'm going to make a quick plane here. And we'll come back and bring it over kind of close to this. And that should be good. And this is kind of going to work the same way. First thing I want to do is get rid of these, all the extra edges here. And I'm going to convert this down to an editable poly. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make sure this is selected, and I'm going to draw on this surface. So the way this works is you can come in and, actually let me move this down a little bit. You can come in and use this tool and kind of snap this to the surface here, for example. And this is for building out topology from the ground up. The next tool you would want to use is this guy right here, the extend or the step build. I'm going to use extend for this example here, but what we're going to be working on is the edges. So with this turned on, with this toggled on, I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm just going to drag out one group of polygons at a time. And this is a really, really good tool. I mean, it's really fast, and it kind of works with you. It doesn't work against you or anything like that. Another way to use this is if you have something like this and you're in your vertex mode, you can actually come in and just start pulling out, vertices. It basically takes sort of a half a square, and you can come in and pull out extra sections like this. I use this all the time, but that's kind of a rundown on how to build topology, like fresh stuff. Either if you had a high or a low poly already to begin with, or you needed to come in and start building something from scratch. I use this, it's like I was saying, it's kind of the backbone of what I use to build fresh low poly topology on top of a high. But I'm going to go back and do what I talked about earlier, and I'm going to clean that up, and then we'll be back to kind of move the project forward. Okay, so I went ahead and I cleaned up that low poly, and in this section here, I just kind of want to give you a brief overview of where we started, what I ended up with, and how everything kind of compared side by side with the high poly from zBrush. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this section because I do want to move on to baking in xNormal. But the first thing I want to show you here is, once I started to break this mesh down, there's a couple of things, a couple ways I went about it. First of all was obviously getting rid of the edges, these extra edges. The second thing is this mesh, this low poly, going to support a decent bake? And the third thing, talking about like the silhouette, is, does it support a decent silhouette? Does it keep up with the overall look I'm going for? For example, like I was mentioning earlier, I wasn't sure if I was going to keep that strap. And really, I was kind of setting this up with the idea it's going to be viewed in third person, maybe back here or up to here. And it really doesn't warrant keeping this. It's not enough silhouette to keep all that extra topology on there. On the bottom half, though, I decided to keep this here. And then this would have actually been just too much altogether for something like this. So I wanted to completely get rid of all this down here. And on the back side of the mesh, I got rid of all these extra edges. There's not really a lot going on back here, so we really don't need anything special. On the strap, I ended up keeping one edge in the middle, and then I ended up keeping two edges on top. And the reason for that is I wanted to, let me grab onto this real quick, turn real smooth on. But you can see what I have kind of going on here. I wanted to keep the surface of this bubbled up a little bit and kind of rough, sort of how this is. So if you do happen to view it on its side, it's got something going on. It's not just straight and hard and boring, but it's got something going here. Same with this bottom here. Technically, you could bake this straight down flat onto a flat surface, but when I kind of build up a surface like that and you're looking at it along the side here, it helps. And let's say you're doing like a third-person fighting game, like kind of how Batman or something was, and you can swing the camera down. It matters now and then to have this extra kind of stuff. Now, if this were in a phone app game or something like that, when you're going to be viewing it from way back here, of course not. And if that were the case, I'd even take more out of here. But I'm also kind of doing this for beauty renders too. So comparing it to the sculpt from zBrush, I just kind of wanted to give you one last rundown on that. But you kind of see what I did here. I went in and cleaned up all this here, so it's got a nice, it runs along the high poly as close as possible. And, that's kind of an overview of how I went about going about this. It's not the only way, of course. If for some reason you wanted to keep these extra details like this down here or even here, you can. I felt this is a pretty balanced setup for what I'm doing with it. The next thing I want to move on to though is the unwrap for the test bake. Now the test bake isn't as technical and crazy or whatever as it sounds. All that means I'm going to spend about 30 seconds unwrapping this thing because we just need it unwrapped good enough to bake, but not good enough, to texture on. So to kind of show you that, I'm just going to come in here and quick throw an unwrap on there. And actually I already went ahead and did this ahead of time, but we'll do it again just to show you. It's all I would do is I'm going to grab all these pieces here, and this is just for Macs. Maybe Maya or Blender might be different. They might have these tools too. I don't use those, so I'm not really sure. But we're going to go to mapping and flat mapping. I usually run this between 45 to 65 degrees. I'll try 60 with this one. We'll hit OK, and it's all that does is takes and breaks these off into pieces based off the angle I had set it at. Next thing I want to do is go back under Tools and Relax. I need these pieces relaxed out. And I usually up the pull amount here. We'll just relax it out a little bit, and then I'll go to Tools and then Pack UVs, and then we're going to fill holes. You don't. It just depends whether you need that or not. With this, I just kind of use it anyways. But click OK, and that's it. And it just kind of. This is a disaster if you wanted to texture on this, like in Photoshop, but it's perfectly fine. It's just all we need to do our test bake, and that's all that's involved in setting up a test bake. Then we just convert that back down to an editable poly and we're set. So the next step is what I do anytime I'm really going out to a game engine or starting to do my bakes. I might forget of what I've actually done with this. I might have scaled it or whatever, but I like to reset the X form. I have it in my tools over here because I use it somewhat often. But if you don't have anything like this, it's over under your tools tabs under reset X form. The way it works, you just click on it, you toggle it, it toggles on, and then with the mesh selected, you just select reset selected, and that's it. We toggle it back off, and then when you come back here, it's going to have this orange bounding box around it with the X form modifier on the stack. You don't need to do anything else to it after this. All we're going to do is hit or convert this down to editable poly or collapse it back down the modifier stack, and that's it. Sometimes I like to also reset my pivot point. I already have earlier, so I didn't need to do it. But sometimes, when you're working on stuff or whatever, your pivot might, end up in different areas, just kind of depending on what you were doing. But anyways, that covers this section of what I did to kind of set this up. And the reason I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, because there's a million and one different scenarios. And, you just have to kind of get in there and get your hands dirty and just feel this out yourself as you go. But the next part I want to go on to is actually doing our test bake using xNormal. And we'll be viewing this in Toolbag too to kind of see our final results. So, okay, with this next section here, we'll be talking about xNormal and doing bakes in that. If you haven't used xNormal yet, I recommend kind of at least checking it out. It's a great piece of software for doing all kinds of different baking. It's got more different types of bakes it can do than pretty much anything out there. And the strongest point, at least in the workflow I use, is it's really good for doing stuff where you're dealing with sculpts. This here is pretty dense, and this is absolutely nothing compared to how high a mesh coming out of zBrush or Mudbox can actually get. And when you start importing stuff like this into a modeling program, it gets pretty dogged down pretty quick. I mean, you can get up to on at least my machine, I've gone up to 2 to 3 million, but anything more than that, and it's easy to do with a sculpt, things get pretty nasty in a hurry. So I kind of just, anytime I'm doing sculpting, I just use xNormal, and it does really good bakes too. But getting right into it, what I want to first talk about is they actually have their own format. I don't use it because I've had issues in the past, a lot of baking errors, but I'm going to let you know it's kind of there to begin with. But if we go over here and go to export selected, it's going to be right here in your drop-down list. Once you've installed xNormal, you have an option to install a plugin for Macs. And I'm just going to rename this test and then save. The cool thing about it, it has a high definition mesh and a low definition mesh preset, which is nice for a quick workflow. But like I was saying, I've run into issues with it, so I kind of quit using it. And from there, you just kind of export out and then bring your stuff over into xNormal and use that. The way I'm going to show you, though, is kind of how I do it, but quick isolate that. And the first thing you're going to want to do is actually, with the mesh selected, we're going to go into vertex subobject mode. I'm going to grab all the vertices on the whole mesh. And then I'm going to hit connect. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you export a mesh out of a 3D application, sometimes, let me go into polygon mode so you can actually see this better. Your polygons are actually two triangles together. And sometimes these triangles or the triangulation can get flipped, and if any one of these, just one, is flipped, xNormal will reject it. It won't actually accept the bake. So it basically is what happens is this here. One of these get flipped. So to remedy that, the first thing we do is we grab all the vertices on the whole mesh, and I hit connect. And that way it locks everything in, and there's nothing that could possibly even be flipped. The next thing you do is come over here to your drop-down list and go to under projection. Where is that? Right there. This projection cage is absolutely identical to the one we were using before. When we hit 0 on our keyboard and we were doing all this kind of stuff. So we'll go over here, and I like to use the shaded so we can kind of see what we're doing. Actually, I'm going to unisolate that. And from here, all we're going to do is, like we did before, is we're going to push the cage out past our high poly. Now, normally, I'm just doing a test bake now, so I won't be actually using a cage. But normally, I would have had it exploded these two elements away from each other and done just this. I will export actually the cage this time around just to kind of show you how it's done. But I don't think I'll be using it for the actual test bake. But the next step here, once you're satisfied with how the cage looks, we will go down here to export, and then it gives sort of a generic name. You can name it whatever you want. Generally speaking, since you have that cage 001, that's pretty unique, and that should work for you. But then at that point, you just click OK. Is what this actually did. It didn't export your cage out of Max, but it created another mesh right directly on top of where your cage is. So I go over to my item list here. You can see the object 024 cage 001. I'm going to click OK on that. And that's actually, I can isolate it, but that's actually a separate mesh in our scene, and this is what we'll export. So to kind of recap, let me move that out of the way. We had our low poly with the cage, and this here would have been exported out, and we have our cage itself. And the cage, the low poly and the cage both get exported out with all the vertices connected like this. Let me back out of here a couple times. So at this point, you're pretty much ready to bake once you've had those two exported out. I already, before I started doing this video, I exported the high poly out of 3ds or out of zBrush ahead of time. So the next part we'll actually be looking at the xNormal UI and then going through a test bake with it and then checking it out in Toolbag. Okay, before we move on to the next section, there's actually something really important I need to talk about, and that's doing your ambient occlusion bake. So far, I've been kind of pushing the idea of exploding your elements away from each other, kind of like I have in this version here, which you should do for your normal bake. But when you're doing your ambient occlusion bake, you're going to want a separate version, the same workflow as you did with the exploded version here for the normal map, but you're going to want to have a separate version like this for doing your ambient occlusion bake. And the reason for that is because if I were to bake this down, do an AO bake on this, I would get some definition down in here and some shading and definition, across the details here. But that dark shading that would come, in here below this strap or in back here, nothing would show up. And that's, pretty important that that you keep these two together. So to kind of recap on an actual workflow, you're going to have one version here like this for the normal bake. You're going to have one version like this for the ambient occlusion bake, and as an option, you could also bake the AO map, like a secondary AO map like this, and then composite both AO maps down in Photoshop. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Another option you can also do too, what I kind of need to mention, is you don't actually need a high poly mesh to do an ambient occlusion bake. Like right now, we could actually just take our low poly by itself and do an AO bake just as it sits without any high poly at all. So that's kind of one thing I needed to bring up before we moved on to the next section. Okay, so once you got xNormal installed and opened up, this is kind of the initial UI you see when you open it up. One nice thing about xNormal is all the different options, all the different baking options it has right under this tab here. One of the kind of cool things it can do under the render, you can use the default bucket render, which is what I usually use, but you can also use your GPU cores to do some pretty quick rendering. Like sometimes when I've used this, when I've tried this, I've been doing AO maps. You have to come in here and actually up the settings, but it can bake an AO map out pretty quick. But I'm kind of getting ahead a little bit on there. So before we get into any of this, I actually want to come back and show you the workflow of getting stuff into xNormal. So going back to the high definition meshes section, I'm going to right click on this tab here, and we're just going to go to add meshes. Then we're going to come down, I'm going to add the mesh I exported out of ZBrush, which is the case high poly OBJ. And the settings up here, up top, once we add a mesh, you kind of notice a couple things come up. I generally don't mess with these other than the mesh scale. One issue you can come up with in baking is sometimes when you have a mesh that's kind of scaled down, you have a lot of detail in it, you can run into baking errors. So this is kind of the only setting I'll ever change. But if you are going to use this, generally I'll set, like if I set this to 2, for example, I'd also set my low definition mesh in its scale to 2 as well. But moving on to the low definition mesh, it's brought in the same way. We right click on this, add meshes, come down. In this case, I'm going to add the case low poly. Now on the low poly section, I'm actually there's a couple things I need to go over. The first one is the minimum frontal and maximum rear ray distance. These numbers here are just sort of generic, straight up numbers of a minimum, maximum ray distance that xNormal uses. Max has the same thing, but since I kind of always use a cage in there, I didn't really go over baking without a cage in there. But there's actually a tool that xNormal has for setting these min and max up if you're not going to use a cage. And that's right under here under the Tools tab and then under Ray Distance Calculator. When I click on this, a pretty simple dialog box comes up, and it's all you do is click Go. And once you do that, xNormal goes and checks out your high and low poly mesh and tries its best to come up with a minimum and maximum ray distance based off of what you have instead of just a generic 0.5 and 0.5. Now, the numbers it comes up with are sometimes better than the 0.5 and 0.5, but nevertheless, a cage, generally speaking, is still the most accurate way. Because let's say, this is sort of an average figure, and baking with a cage is continuously much more accurate as you go across the surface of your mesh. You may have small areas that expand out into larger areas and then steep angles and shallow ones. As good as this does, a cage is still generally better. Not every time, but usually. I'm not going to use these numbers this time around in our test bake, so I'm just going to close that. But once you're satisfied with these values, you'll hit stop, and then you can just click Copy Results. Once you click that, it copies those results over to right here. So instead of 0.5, you'll have the values that came up with. The next thing I want to talk about is this Use Cage thing. Now, if I right-click on this box again and go to Browse External Cage File, this is where I would bring in the cage that we've made in Max. So the case low poly cage, OBJ. Now you'll see this come up. And this is why we connected all the verts together. Basically, this is telling you that unless the topology on your meshes on your low poly mesh and your cage aren't absolutely identical, xNormal won't work right, and it'll spit it out. So we're going to click OK on that. I'm actually not going to be using a cage on our first test bake, but I'm just kind of giving you a rundown. The next thing I want to talk about is smooth normals. Now, normally I use exported normal because I would have already known what I needed, and I just use this. So in our case, we have everything set to one smoothing group. Average normals is, let's say you had multiple smoothing groups, but you wanted to basically set up as if you had everything set to one. This is what average normals does. And the final one is hard normals. This gives you sort of a faceted, like if you were to it's basically, that faceted look on your low poly when you have a separate normal value for each polygon. I generally never really use that, or I haven't in any kind of recent projects, but that's kind of what these three do. But usually I'm going to use exported normals. Let's see. That pretty much covers everything I use in the low poly section, so I can actually move on. One thing I'm going to do is untick the cage because we're not going to use it this time around. But going down the baking options, since we're just doing the normal map, like the most common maps generally you're going to use is a normal map and the AO map. So, starting out with the normal map, these boxes here are where you actually can adjust different values they have for each map. And up in here, you can adjust your texture size. We're going to go up to 2K, just because it's a quick render, even because it's a normal map. They don't take very long. The edge padding, once again, we've seen this before. It's pretty straightforward. And then the bucket size, I generally stay with 256. Generally, like in Max anyway, the larger bucket you have, the better quality results you generally get. I don't know if that same theory transfers over to xNormal. But generally speaking, I stay with 256, and then anti-aliasing. For your initial pass, especially if you're doing an AO map, like if you're just doing test renders, stick with 1 because it's kind of a waste and it takes a lot of extra time. For test baking and whatnot on your normal map, kind of the same thing. But the first thing we're going to do is go to our normal map, and click this. And the things, let me set that to default. All right, the first thing you'll notice here is you can change the texture coordinates. Now you can change these values out and change the actual the X, Y, and Z on these. Generally speaking, you don't have to. Most things, not everything, but most things just usually get changed in the Y value, either Y plus or Y negative. In this case, we're going to be baking out to Y plus because we're going to be viewing it in Toolbag, but that's the settings there. The background color by default, it should be 128, 128, 255 in your RGB. That's kind of like the standard that it should be set to. And there's really no reason to change this, so I don't, but I'm just kind of letting you know it's there. And then when tangent is checked, of course we're baking on a tangent. If it's not, we're doing an object space normal map. So, it's just either an on or off thing, but since we are doing a tangent space map, I'll leave that on. So now that we have everything set up here, the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and do the bakes. So I'm going to quick pause. We'll go ahead and bake it out because I kind of want to show you what it's going to do while we're baking. So we're just going to click Generate Maps, and it's going to. One thing I might also mention too, right up here under Notify Tile Updates, if you don't have that turned on, it'll just kind of stay solid. But if you want to actually watch this thing being rendered out, that can be changed right here. But here's sort of just kind of a rough rundown of the normal map. And as what I'll do next is I'll actually we'll upload this up into Toolbag and check it out. Okay, before I move on to the next section, there's actually something pretty important I left out from the previous, and that's your file output. Where you're actually saving it to. Under the Baking Options tab, under Output File, it's right at the top here. And basically, here's the path. And you can just type in the name here. Or if not, you can click the green box, type in the name here, and then click Save. It's pretty obvious. It's kind of just like everything else, but I figured I'd mention it so you're not kind of digging around looking where you actually output this file to. The next thing is in xNormal, it actually adds for you an underscore and the type of map you baked out on the name. So, for example, mine I named Case 2. Then xNormal came in and put an underscore normals, and it does that for every type of map you bake out. So those are a couple things I just kind of want to mention before we move on. But actually going to our test bake here in Toolbag, I'm pretty satisfied with the overall results. It looked about how I was looking for it to look. The only problem you ran into is right here. If you look right here, and hopefully you can see that on the video, I've got this sort of projection going on from the top half, and the reason that happened was because I'm not using a cage and I didn't explode my elements away from each other. So if you ever run into a situation like this, look for something like that, because this will happen. But for the test bake purposes, we're fine. And the next thing I wanted to actually kind of talk about too is setting up a scene that's good enough to test your normals in. Now in Toolbag, by default, it uses an image-based or material-based lighting. So anytime I bring a mesh in, you're already ready to go. Now if you want to check your normals in like Max or another modeling program, by default they don't use a specific kind of lighting because this is expensive to render. They just use a basic like modeling ambient lighting, and that's not going to work for testing normals. So what you want to do, and what I normally do, is let me actually turn off the skylight. I bring in an Omni light into the scene. I like using those. And it's what you want to do basically is once you get your light in the scene, kind of sweep it across the surface. And we're looking for not only errors, but we're looking for, is this actually holding up and looking like the way we want it to? Is it going to give off the look that we kind of need it to in game or whatever application you happen to be working in? And that's kind of the main idea of how to check for normals or baking errors and whatnot in a modeling program or something like that. But the next thing I want to talk about is normals themselves and normal maps. Since we have this set up, I'd like to kind of draw your attention down to the bottom half here. Now, the best you're ever going to view a normal map is straight on, like how we have here. But take notice what happens when I rotate the camera angle down. We kind of lose all that depth and effect and everything we had when it was right here. And the reason for that is because we have no geometry supporting the normals. when it's being rendered out, generally speaking, both the normals and the mesh kind of work together to give you the overall look. But when you just have a flat plane, let me actually turn my wires on real quick. The only thing we have here is the normal map holding up the whole bottom half of this thing, other than a couple edges down here. Let's compare that though to the top half, where I kind of going back to what I was mentioning here, where I added this extra geometry in. Let me turn my wires off again and kind of take a look at it straight on. It looks pretty solid. Things are basically how the high poly looked. But as I sweep the camera down, it still holds up. And that's because we actually have some polygons here facing the camera as I come down to the side, as opposed to this where it's just a flat plane. So to kind of recap on everything, it's a constant balancing act of your tri count or your poly count and how much detail you need to keep in your mesh as you're working along. That kind of concludes the section of doing our test bake. And the next section will actually be our last, and is what I wanted to go through in there is some common errors and how to fix them. It will be just sort of a kind of a quick rundown and a recap of things we've gone over. Okay, for the next and final section of this tutorial, we're going to be working back in Max, kind of back on the character again. And so what I want to go over is common workflow problems and modeling issues that you can run into along the way that will give you rendering errors and baking errors. But the piece we'll be working on is the side holster again. So let me go ahead and isolate that, and I'm going to turn my edges on again. But the first thing I want to talk about is n-gons. Now, n-gons are polygons that have more than 4 sides. Like I was talking about before, it's okay to use triangles, and ideally we want quads. But if you have a situation where you have n-gons, you're going to run into all kinds of rendering and baking problems. And to reproduce this, I'm actually going to go up to my edge sub-object mode. I'm actually going to insert a vertex right on this edge here, and then I'm going to actually move this up towards the middle. And without further explanation, you can already see we got some kind of smoothing problems going on here. If I turn my edges off, you can really see it show up. But something like this, like I was saying, you want to completely avoid this altogether. You don't want to have any n-gons anywhere on your mesh when you're, even if you're not going to be doing any bakes, these will cause problems with your rendering just on your low poly. But to expand on that even more, this isn't really the common problem. The common problem is having 2 vertices piled up on top of each other like that. Like if you're using the symmetry tool or just different things like that, this situation, or even if it's just kind of slightly off center, this can happen. So, to remedy this problem is what you can do is come into your vertex sub-object mode, either select everything or just hit Control-A and grab it all, and then go to your weld tool. And if I go under settings, normally you don't want to set to, like, for example, 0.5. It's going to start welding everything up. We don't want that. Is what you're looking for, is what I usually run this at, is like 0.005 or 0.001. And you can see here we have, before it was at 565, and after welding it's at 564. So that's kind of a tool to use, your weld tool, to get rid of that problem altogether. But let's say we weren't at that part. How do I actually identify the problem to begin with? So I'm actually going to weld this up because I want to keep this n-gon going here. I'm going to back out of this, and I'm going to go to my polygon sub-object mode. And over in your Graphite Modeling Tools, under Selection, at the very bottom you have a selection tool here. You'll see an equal to, less than, or greater than. So what we want to do is set the sides to 4. And have this on greater than, so it's looking for anything that has greater than 4 sides, and then we'll click to select. So what you can see what happened here is it selected the polygons that have greater than 4 sides. So you'd know right off the bat, and this is a simple mesh. If you were working on like a very large project with a lot of stuff, these tools become a lot more valuable. And that's just a quick way to identify problems like that. So at this point you go, okay, we have an issue here. Let's go over to our vertex sub-object mode, select it all, and we're going to weld it up. Boom, problem solved. So the next thing I want to talk about, though, is the STL check tool. It's kind of an old school tool, but it's still, worth mentioning. Let me actually grab onto this polygon here and I'm going to delete it. Now, of course, we know I deleted this out, but let's say we're working on, like I was saying, a much larger project. Now, if I throw the STL check on there, it's in your modifier stack here, your list. It's right here under the S's for STL check. And it's what it does is it allows you to check the mesh for errors. Open edges, double faces, spike, multiple edges, or everything. And it's all you have to do is come in here and click check. Now, when I click that, I can actually reveal this out by faces or edges or don't select too. That's kind of a nice feature there too. But of course, I got this open edges here, and if we didn't really intend this, like if this was kind of buried way down in here or something like that, and I might not have seen it, this will show up clear as day. There's an issue with the mesh. So this is kind of another quick way to check the mesh for errors. I'm going to Control Z out of this a couple times again and show you another tool here too. But the next tool I want to talk about is sometimes when you run into a situation where you've got a normal issue going on and things aren't rendering out right and you don't really know what's going on, there's actually a tool over it. Now I have kind of a special menu up here, but it's under the same category. If you go under modifiers and then geometry, it's right here called normal modifier. Is what this does, let me double check to make sure this material, yeah, I'm going to set this to one-sided again. But it's what this does is you can actually unify the normals and then flip them all together at once. That way we know that the normals are sort of equalized out. And I've actually been able to correct different rendering in normal problems with this here. Sometimes when you're creating geometry with splines, when you actually go to create it over to an editable poly, you get weird kind of normal issues going on. And I've been able to correct that problem using this here. But once we unify them and flip them out, you can either collapse it down or, I always usually just convert it to an editable poly again. And then I'm going to come back in onto my polygon subobject mode, Control A, and then flip them back. And that pretty much it won't fix the problem every time, but it definitely can help fix the problem sometime. It's worth actually at least trying. Once in a while, you can run into a problem where normals will be flipped, like not the whole thing. It might have been a user error. It might have been a max error along the way. But let me actually go ahead and turn this double-sided back on again, kind of show you what's going on. But now if I come down into my polygon subobject mode, select that, flip it. There is kind of a smoothing error here, but it might not be all that noticeable if you're working on a really big project. But when you go to bake it out, it's like, oh hey, heck, what's going on here? All you really need to do sometimes to identify certain problems is just come here and do a quick render. Like you can see how much more noticeable this problem is as opposed to in the viewport here. I mean, yeah, you can see it, but like I was saying, on a larger project, you might not notice that. Just come in and do a render, and the problem comes out clear as day. The next tool I want to talk about, I actually did mention it earlier in the tutorial, but over in your Utilities tab down here on Reset Xform, I'm just kind of mentioning it again, just kind of as a fresh reminder, because this one's really important, especially with stuff working in Max. Basically, anytime you scale a mesh up, okay, we saw it scale up in our viewport, but the data and the information behind the scenes making all this happen didn't scale. So anytime you scale a mesh, you also eventually at some point want to reset the Xform. Especially if you're going out to a game engine, you're going to be doing baking and stuff like that. I always do that. So I know I just thought I'd kind of mention that one again, just as a refresher. But something that, it's kind of one of those things that might not be so obvious, but, maybe it is. But if you're having rendering issues on your mesh or baking problems in Max, and you just don't know what else to do, one thing that I've had happen in the past that corrected a problem is just actually exporting this out as an OBJ and then re-importing it back into the scene. So you just grab onto the mesh. We go to Export Selected. I just select a name and then Save. Now, normally when I export OBJs, I want to do normals and smoothing groups. I don't really use this optimized stuff. And then as far as materials, it depends on whether you want that or not. A lot of times I won't use it, especially for like just repairing something. And then we'll export that out, and then we'll re-import it back into the scene. Once again, it's one of those things that it won't solve the problem every time, but I have had success fixing different errors and stuff like that on a mesh, especially going back to the spline issue too. When you have flipped normals after converting a spline to an editable poly, that helped tremendously a couple times. So the final tool I wanted to kind of mention to you was, this tool isn't really used all that often, but it's up under modifiers and under geometry, and then it's called Edit Normals Modifier, and it basically is what it kind of says it is, and in the sense that, first of all, you can see actually the direction of the normals and what direction they're going, so it's almost kind of a nice diagnostic tool in a way. But if you needed to, for whatever reason, you can actually come in and start tweaking and editing the normals manually. Once again, this isn't something that you're going to use that often, but I just kind of wanted to let you know it's there. And then it's got stuff like unify and break. It's got some tools that you can possibly try to diagnose and repair a mesh's normals with. So, all in all, that's kind of the tools I wanted to go over and wanted to show you. But essentially, that's kind of wraps up the end of this tutorial. I hope that you kind of found some useful information out of it. And if you're having problems doing baking and whatnot, just kind of keep at it. It's kind of a learning process. Just try different things, and eventually you'll get the hang of it, and you'll just be able to slam these textures out, with no problem. But my name is Justin Dewey, and I hope you enjoyed my tutorial, and we'll see you then.